Hello, this is module 4.4, 5.4.4. There you go. Fungal taxonomy 2. We were talking about the different phyla of fungi. Last time we talked about phylum Zygomycota and phylum Ascomycota. The third phylum we're going to consider as we look at fungal taxonomy is phylum Basidiomycota. Note once again the common suffix, making these names much easier to learn. Basidio means club, so these are properly called the club fungi. People don't really call them common mushrooms, but that's probably what you think of them as. Ascomycota had fleshy fruiting bodies as well that produce sexual spores, so I think it would be correct to call them mushrooms. We actually have technical terms that we don't use. In Ascomycota, they're ascocarps. In Basidiomycota, they're basidiocarps, so we're just going to call them all mushrooms. We are going to make you learn two genera here. Genus Amanita over here in the lower right. This is, of course, the same genus of mushroom we learned about during DNA. Some of the poisonous species of Amanita, such as Amanita phalloides, contain alpha-amanitin, an RNA polymerase inhibitor, and that's what is believed to have killed Claudius Caesar, for example. So we're going to learn Amanita, and over on the left is Agaricus. Agaricus is the genus of the grocery store button mushroom. It's also the genus of, like, the portabella, which is just a different species of Agaricus. So we are, you should recognize that the sexual spores in phylum Basidiomycota, they're formed on little bumps on the gills called basidia, singular basidium. Basidia means little club. And so these little clubs, and that's why they're called the club fungi, they produce their spores there. This is a very nice scanning electron micrograph that shows these little white clubs, and each one of them can support several. Often it's 2 or 4 spores. And so there's the basidium, and there is the spore up above. And these are supposed to be club-shaped little structures. This material down here at the bottom is the gill. And so here we can see a photograph again. This is from a light microscope, more typical of what you'd see through your microscope here in the lab. But there's the basidium, the little bump, and there are the spores. And this shows the life cycle, and it's again very similar that the fungus body is haploid, the fruiting body has nuclei from 2 different mating types together, and those mating types fuse and create a diploid stage, something like a zygote, and then it immediately undergoes meiosis and produces, because meiosis produces 4 cells, those are the 4 spores which result. And so yeah, that's about all you probably need to know about the life cycle. You should be able to draw a mushroom, something like this. I want to make a few changes here, so let me, bring up my pen. And so you should draw a mushroom like this. If you don't know how to draw one, just make the stalk like this, and then you make a kind of a circle like that, and the cap up on top, and make these these gills radiating out from the central stalk. And we want a cup on there, and this is going to be the base, and then we're going to have some mycelium, and then we want a ring on the stalk as well. Okay, so we're going to call these, this is actually an error. So down here, this will be the mycelium, or the hyphae that are growing down there. At the base of the stem is a cup, or a vulva, and I want you to know both names. The vulva means a cup, and we'll talk about where that comes from later. We're going to call this the stem or the stalk. This is actually an error right here. It should be the technical name, which I'm not asking you to know, is stipe. So it's not stape, it's stipe. But stem or stalk is fine for us to know for that. I want you to know both these names. So here I'll cross out the names you don't have to know. And I want you to know both those. The gills are these radiating plates underneath the cap. And why are there gills? And you don't have to know the technical name of lamella. Why are there gills? Because they actually provide more surface area and they produce spores. You should know the name cap for the top. You don't have to know pileus. And then you can call these scales. Sometimes they're called spots, and they're not always present. So here, I didn't make them on mine. There we are. There's some. Now, one thing I want you to recognize is that in fungi, we have protective structures called veils. And there's two types of veils. We have a partial veil. And what it does is it covers the gills. And this is when the mushroom is developing. It's not all large and expanded like we see here. Rather, it's small. And the ring or the annulus is the remnant or leftovers of the partial veil. And what happened as the cap expanded, the partial veil tore and formed this ring on the stalk. So this used to be connected up like that and providing a protection. But as the cap expanded, that tore and left us only the ring. Now we also have a second kind of veil. So the first kind of veil is a partial veil. The second kind of veil is the universal veil. Universal veil. And the universal veil was like an egg that covered the whole mushroom, and it was just a little baby. And the cup, or the vulva, is the base of that little egg, and so the whole mushroom was inside there. And as it grew upward, it tore and left the cup at the base of the stalk. And so the cup is a remnant of the universal veil. Also, the spots and the scales on the top can also be a remnant of the top part of the universal veil. Universal veil. So make sure you draw a little mushroom like this, label it, and add all these annotations about the veils and such. This actually shows a lot of that right here. This is a diagram I like to put in. If we look over here at the very left, this is the universal veil that's all the way around, number 10, and we can see it there. And as the mushroom elongates, it tears the universal veil, leaving this cup at the base. The vulva or the cup is number 6, and there it is. We can see that as the fruiting body comes up, that number 8 is the partial veil, and it is covering the gills, but as that cap expands, it tears away, and the remnant of number 8 is number 9, the annulus or the ring. And so this is a remnant of this partial veil. And these little patches and spots or scales on the top, these are also remnants of the universal veil. You can see here they are, and as it expands, they become little patches or spots up on the top. Now, it'd be really nice if mushrooms had this kind of warning. Amanitas, some of them are deadly poisonous, but they don't have a skull and crossbones. If we zoom in, this is actually showing the gills, and if we zoom in, this is what we see. So these yellow structures would be the basidia, and the dark structures would be the spores. Although on an amanita, the spores would be white, not dark. This shows some veils. Now, one thing you have to understand is all mushrooms don't have veils. Some mushrooms don't have any veils. Some mushrooms have only a partial veil. Some have both a partial and a universal veil. So they can have almost any combination of them. This is just some paintings of different fruiting bodies. Here's an earth star. These occur sometimes in my backyard. Here's a conch, which is growing on a wood. Here's a coral fungus. Here's a puffball. This one's scientific name is Phallus impudicans, And it was thought, of course, it's supposed to look like a penis, and so it was thought improper for young ladies to study this mushroom during the Victorian era. That actually grows in my backyard, and on the very end of the fruiting body there, it has this dark greenish black slime that stinks to high heaven. That's why they're called, the common name of them is stinkhorns, and those spores are dispersed by flies. Very interesting kind of relationship. And some of these others are more typical fruiting bodies, although if you look up here, this one doesn't have gills underneath there. It has pores, a bunch of little pores underneath there, and these pores or tubes are lined with basidia. And here you can see we actually threw in an ascomycete, member of the Ascomycota. That's Morchella, the genus you're supposed to know. Most of these others are from the Basidiomycota. Puffballs are in the Basidiomycota. Most of them are about as big as a hacky sack. But look at this guy. He's found some giant puffballs, and he's showing that there is fun in fungi. And I want you to notice something. Look what he's drinking. That's not even beer, and he's making a snowman out of giant puffballs. So I guess there is fun in fungi. Ha ha. This is a huge dead red fir. This tree is, I don't know, at least 4 feet in diameter. It was huge. And this is many pounds of sulfur shelf mushrooms. And the reason that fungus is growing on this tree is because it is dead. The fungus didn't kill the tree, but the fungus is taking advantage of the dead tree to feed itself. And it produced, I don't know, there must be 60 or 80 pounds of fungi there. I probably took maybe a fourth of it or something like that and gave it away. I don't personally care for the taste of this one, so I didn't eat that, but it is an edible fungus. If you look at, this is a close-up that I took, and you can see that the pores haven't even formed. These will have pores that will produce spores, and so this is a very young fruiting body. And so, quite good. These mushrooms are much more choice in my mind. These are morels. That's my hat with morels in it. This big one right here is a king bolete. It has all sorts of names. The Italian name is porcini. In France, it's the cep, C-E-P. In Germany, it's the Steinpelz. I don't say that quite right, I know. Here's a coral fungus. And this is actually an inky cap down here. And this used to be tall like a bowling pin, and it's actually self-digested its gills. They call this self-deliquescence. And the black juice that comes off here contains spores. This is considered very advanced. And my friend who taught me about mushrooms used to make black pasta from inky caps. So interesting kind of stuff going on here. Here's a picture of my wife, Christy Charters. She teaches biology here. And these are 2 very large Boletus edulis, or porcini mushrooms, that we found in the mountains of California. These are a little bit too far gone. They're likely to have some little mushroom flies in them. And, of course, what do we call the larva of a fly? Well, it's a maggot. There's little mushroom maggots that get in here. You just pick them out, but they can actually reproduce asexually. This is an adaptation for living on mushrooms, which are a very spotty resource, and so they can reproduce. So it's important that you pull them out. Let's look at the fourth and final group of fungi. This is phylum Deuteromycota. The common name of these is the Latin term, the fungi imperfecti, which means the imperfect fungi. These are mostly molds, but they're grouped into this category, into this phylum, because they have no known sexual stage. That's a very poor reason to group things together, and we called them imperfect because we didn't know how they reproduce sexually. And some of them, in fact, as far as you know, still don't have a sexual mode of reproduction. But it is an artificial taxon or artificial category, and it's being phased out because of DNA analysis. We can find out who's related to who and don't have to depend on just how they reproduce. Most of them, it's been found, most of these molds belong in the Ascomycota. And we can see here a representative genus to know is Penicillium. Penicillium produced penicillin, the first antibiotic that we discovered. And so if you may have seen this bluish-green mold growing on oranges or other things, and it's quite quite pretty in a way, but Aspergillus, which is of similar color, can be somewhat dangerous, so you got to watch what you're doing there. I'm giving you some homework here. This is good advice. I'm not going to grade or collect this. I think you should make a table of the 4 phyla of fungi and compare and contrast their major features. How can you tell the difference? In that table, I'd certainly put the representative genera for each phylum and how they reproduce sexually, and a few other interesting facts, maybe about the life cycle or something like that. So we have one more slide, and then we can look at a few for interest, and that will end this module. But we want to look at the importance of fungi. Fungi have a lot of important roles. Many of them are ecological, so I could just put ecological, but I want to kind of tease it apart. Their role as decomposers is critical to the functioning of many ecosystems. Mycorrhiza, absolutely essential for many of the plants, the producers of ecosystems, and so this mutualistic relationship is critical. Fungi can also serve in an economic or medical function or role, where they produce antibiotics. Penicillin and many of the antibiotics are derived from fungi, but also other drugs are derived from fungi. For example, the drug cyclosporin is a drug which will retard the immune system, and it's almost always given to transplant patients. So if you have a heart transplant or a kidney transplant, you'll be taking cyclosporin to prevent your immune system from rejecting the organ. Fungi are also a very important food source. If you don't eat meat, then they are a very good source of protein. Some cultures are fungophilic, mushroom-loving, and some are fungophobic. Americans tend on the fungophobic side, some of them, but cultures such as the Russian culture or some of the Oriental cultures or the European cultures, they would never think of cooking without mushrooms. And some of the mushrooms, the truffles, for example, can be very expensive. They have interesting smells. They co-evolve with squirrels, and so they give off this interesting odor. And of course, this is very expensive. This is the weight for a dried pound of black truffles. Wet, they wouldn't be so much, or fresh, they wouldn't be so much. One perfect matsutake mushroom in Japan can bring $200. But again, you can go out and collect mushrooms for free, and you can really have a fun time even if you don't find any. So I recommend you try it, but you have to be very cautious because there are old mushroom hunters and there are bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old, bold mushroom hunters, because if you're too bold, you're going to poison yourself and die. You have to identify the mushrooms, so you need to get a good field guide and make certain of anything that you eat that it's safe to do so. And one more importance, I think, is mushrooms are very beautiful. They're ephemeral, which means that the fruiting body itself is short-lived and the fungus grows out of sight underground. We've come almost to the end of this module, but I want to show you a few pictures. Here's a huge mushroom they found down in southern Mexico. Really kind of interesting. It's not Photoshop, that's a real deal. And these are also huge mushrooms from various parts of the world. Very interesting stuff. Here you should be able to identify these structures. This is a basidium, and so this is in the basidiomycota, and these are the spores. This is an ascus. This is from the ascomycota, and there's the spores inside there. And with this slide, it shows a puffball letting out, and they're called puffballs because they put out the puff of spores like this. And we will end this module with the puffball.